Wyoming is an amazing place. We have awesome gradients from the top of cold mountains to extremely dry and relatively warm basins. We have soils that vary from extremely cold and wet to hot springs. And we have indigenous peoples that we're still learning to better collaborate and to fix some of the terrible history that we've had with them. My name is Brent Ewers, and I'm extremely excited today to share with you our project overview. The motivation for our project is that we understand now that microbes are a fundamental part of how ecosystems work and the services that they provide. And so there's this need nationally to understand this. Wyoming's in a unique position to contribute to this because of the landscape from relatively intact systems to extremely extremely impacted, and because of our climate that varies from relatively cold and wet to extremely dry and relatively warm. We're in a position to continue to improve our relationship with indigenous peoples that live in our state. And we'd like to learn to invest the resources that the University of Wyoming through the state of Wyoming has invested in research, education, and economic development. Because of these things, we've taken these NSF funds in order to establish the Microbial Ecology Collaborative, or what we often call MICRO for short. Our vision is that MICRO will be a lasting location and center, and that it will be known nationally and indeed globally as a place of excellence for microbial ecology, the data science that's needed to understand these systems, and the applications that are related to natural and agricultural resource management. And ultimately, when we do these things, we will also diversify Wyoming's economy. We have three components to our project mission. First, we want to fundamentally advance our process or mechanism-based understanding of the microbes and the microbiomes that contribute to soil, vegetation, and fresh water. In order to do this, we also need to develop cutting-edge data science training and research and development capacity in Wyoming. And finally, the public needs to understand better the value of science. And so we are going to promote science outreach, service, and economic programs, as well as enfranchising individuals to be a part of STEM, including by stakeholders on the Wind River Indian Reservation and across other populations through Wyoming. Our goals are that we want to have high impact science outcomes. And so this includes the type of publications, the fundraising that we do, and ultimately these things can increase Wyoming's research competitiveness because it increases our reputation. We also want to have outcomes that lead to more core facility support, and ultimately we want to show the people of Wyoming how science can lead to better economic development. We need to fundamentally alter our relationship between the University of Wyoming and indeed the state of Wyoming and the sovereign tribes, the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho of the Wind River Indian Reservation. And finally, we want to communicate the importance of science to society. Ultimately, we need to move the needle. In other words, we need to be able to measure that individuals have changed their opinion about science, including those who are ambivalent and hostile to it. To do this, we've engaged the state or the jurisdiction of Wyoming in our project. So this is led by the University of Wyoming. It is the sole PhD granting institution in the state of Wyoming. We've also partnered and now collaborate with 7 community colleges. A major part of what they do is they help to improve the overall state high school to higher education pipeline. And in many cases, we seek to take the students at the community colleges and facilitate their transfer to the University of Wyoming. We want to collaborate and we want to transform the historical relationship between Wyoming and the University of Wyoming and the 2 sovereign tribes of the Wind River Indian Reservation. And we are collaborating with Western Ecosystem Technology, or WEST, a private company that consults in statistics And we're going to use this partnership to change the education and career prospects for data science. Now, to get into some of the nuts and bolts, first thing I want to do is give you just an overview of the proportions of how we've been using our project budget. One of the fundamental concepts that we use is that we should always have a transparency within the project of how we're using the budget. And we use our online tools so that the participants can see their project budgets for their individual components, and the co-PIs and science leads can see the entire budget. Now, the way I'm showing these percentages is this is the percentage of what has been spent of total committed over the last 3 years. So these will not add to 100. And one thing I want to start with is that I will note that we've had a 52% carryover in year 3, and normally this would be cause for alarm and extreme concern. But a major reason for this is the COVID pandemic. But in addition, we've at times had slow processing of samples that we'll talk about later. There's actually been a sharp decline in the amount of field collection, especially this summer when we were restricted in moving around the state. And actually the cost of sequencing has been much less than we anticipated. And finally, as we'll talk about later, there are some challenges on the Wind River Indian Reservation, and so we've been slow at getting some of those programs launched. I will also note that we've spent, of the committed to us, about 12% of it that goes back to indirects, and of that, 75% comes back to our Wyoming EPSCoR office in order to run our staff in collaboration with this project. Now, when we look at the science team, so out of their budget management, they're able to actually have a direct oversight of the budget that's allocated to science. And so they make joint decisions. They vote on things, including hiring and how resources are allocated into various areas of the science budget. Of this, 20% goes to personnel, about 10% goes to supplies and travel. We've also allocated our entire $4 million cost share to go towards all of the equipment that is in the project, as well as a large sequencing budget. This cost share is also part of what comes back from the indirect costs. So if we look at the distribution across the other project elements, then the University of Wyoming for our education outreach and diversity, there's another 8% that has been spent so far of the allocation. And the UW management of the project, how we use our external evaluation and our advisory committees, as well as travel and things, and our cyber infrastructure planning, all of that comes to 2%. And then the work with the community colleges, with the Wind River Native Advocacy Center, and with WEST, the environmental statistical consulting firm, comes out to about 2%. Also, what I want to talk about for a bit is some of the barriers and challenges to accomplishing the project. So the first thing is that I already mentioned that the University of Wyoming is the sole PhD granting entity, and this is both a blessing and curse. So the blessing is that the state focuses most of its higher ed resources on us. There's no equivalent of a Wyoming State University. But that's also a curse in that there's a lot of undue oversight and at times pressure from the state on how the university is managed. We also have a large fraction of our overall state, of our budget, comes directly from the state and not from tuition. Another challenge is that there's often a misunderstanding and miscommunication of the University of Wyoming research mission. When you talk to individuals in the state, and indeed some state leaders, they think of a higher education institution as primarily teaching, when in fact the research mission is fundamental to the teaching mission and the outreach mission, and it's fundamental to the economic improvement of the state. And so we use our NSF EPSCoR projects, this track one and the ones that have preceded it, as a microcosm of these barriers and opportunities. And in fact, by leveraging these relatively large investments from NSF, we can try to move state leadership in its understanding of the contribution of research to state economic interests and just the betterment of all the people of the state. Another institutional barrier is that we've had incredible change in UW leadership. We just have a new president who started July 1, and of course this is in the midst of the pandemic. At the beginning of the project, we saw fairly large budget cuts, and now just 3 years later, we're looking at another 20% budget cut for the University of Wyoming. And because of this, the university leadership is often having to do reactionary responses because things are happening so quickly, especially with the pandemic. And at the same time, we've had several new systems. So we've gone entirely to a new budgeting system online. We've gone entirely to a new hiring system. These things take a lot of extra training, they take a lot of extra time, and they've been challenges that we've had to overcome and figure out how to work around. Another challenge is that with all of the change in university leadership, the University of Wyoming Office of Research and Economic Development is a core part of what we do. The EPSCoR office and the state committee is managed by this office. Also, the university-sponsored programs is a major part of how we spend the money for the project. In both of these areas, there's been retirements of many staff because of the change in leadership. There's been barriers to hiring because of budget changes, the hiring freezes, and there's been new models of resourcing. Now we can take advantage of some of these things, and as I'll talk about later, the new models of resourcing include core facilities. And so we hope to use the core facilities that have been funded by this project as models of how the university should take something like an NSF investment and then leverage it to contribute and sustain a core facility. Another really important challenge is the historical ignorance at best, and at worst, the exploitation of the Wind River Indian Reservation. Later, Teresa Spoonhunter will talk about some of the specifics of this. But as a reminder, there are two sovereign tribes, the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho. And so there's actually two different governments that you must deal with whenever collaborating with the Wind River Indian Reservation. There's quite a distance. It's a 4-hour drive to get onto the reservation from the campus of the University of Wyoming. And that's in the summer. In the wintertime, it can be quite a harrowing experience as you try to drive through the blowing snow. The infrastructure is a challenge at the Wind River Indian Reservation. And so when we went to an all online approach to collaboration with them, the lack of high-speed internet and just computers in general has made that a challenge. There's been a very painful past with the University of Wyoming with some very ugly incidents that have happened. And so we've been trying to get past those through our project. And the community colleges have struggled as well, including the closest Central Wyoming Community College. And overall, there just needs to be an increased build of research infrastructure. And this includes things like institutional review boards, or just an understanding by the individuals on the reservation that research can be a positive and not an exploitive experience. Another challenge has been how our institution supports core facilities. And you'll see that this has been pointed out in our reverse site visit, in our external advisory committee. And so we've been working very closely now with the University of Wyoming trustees and with the University of Wyoming administration through the Office of Research and Economic Development on actually core facility budgets and sustainability. And this is a new thing. So later on in the facilities, there will be a stable isotope facility that will be described. That has been sustained for more than 15 years. And so this serves as a model of an EPSCoR investment that happened in the past and how that moves forward. We hope to use that for our genome technology and our ecology and biogeochemistry core facilities to transform them from grant-supported to long-term core facility support when the project ends. And so the documents and the policies for the University of Wyoming to better support core facilities are currently under development. Another challenge is underrepresented minorities or historically excluded persons of color and other historically underrepresented minorities. Now, some of the things that we've done to overcome the lack of representation of these groups in our project and indeed on our campus is, first of all, we've been working closely with the two tribes and their leadership since 2012 on a long-term plan for how do we increase the participation in the STEM pipeline and to have formal collaborations for research. So when we started this long-term plan, the leaders of the reservation told us we should start by engaging with K-6 students, because if we started just with high school students, it's too late and it may be challenging. So we started with K-6 students, and then we've moved on and we've also kept the K-6, but we've improved our high school programs. And so we see that the students that participated in K-6, some of them are now in high school and they're participating in our high school programs. We've also had to build the relationship so that the students who are undergraduates come from the Central Wyoming Community College and are willing, through their start in higher education there, to come to the University of Wyoming. And so we have our first undergraduate student who just started on our project from the Wind River Indian Reservation. And ultimately, we want to continue this plan so that we can also have graduate students that come from the Wind River Indian Reservation. And we have to continue to build these relationships. And as Teresa Spoonhunter will explain later, this is on an individual and a family basis. So every individual student that engages with our project is a major win. Another thing that we need to do is to increase the within Wyoming recruitment of Latinx individuals. This is a growing population within our state, and we need specific strategies to engage and recruit within this population. Northwest Wyoming especially has a fair number of these individuals, and working with other partners on the University of Wyoming campus, we will engage in some recruitment of these individuals, including trying to do some of our outreach work in bilingual approaches, which should help in our recruitment efforts. And finally, the institution itself, the University of Wyoming, has formed a committee to improve and recruit and retain graduate students from underrepresented minorities. And our project will have representation on this committee so that we can be part of using these new tools from the institution to improve our graduate student recruitment. Another challenge that we've had is in faculty mentoring. Now, currently, the University of Wyoming assumes that individual departments do the faculty mentoring. And what this has meant is that the amount of faculty mentoring and how formal it's been has been extremely variable depending on what department a faculty member is recruited into. So now there's emerging institutional recognition that there needs to be more formalized approaches. So our project has hired 3 new faculty, and actually we were able to leverage 1 additional faculty that was not in the proposal. But unfortunately, one of those faculty, Kim Lau, who was recruited into geology and geophysics as a biogeochemist, we lost her to Penn State University. And this was a result caused by several factors, one of which was her partner is a petroleum geologist, and so Penn State was able to put together a package that the University of Wyoming could not meet to move both Kim and her partner to Penn State. Now, we all know that the pandemic is raging, and so I've given an entire slide over to just what is COVID-19 and indeed the presence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus done to our project. So I want to start with, there's been a clear impact on the families and the work of our students, postdocs, staff, and faculty. And I think this is really important to acknowledge. If any of these individuals are a parent or they're taking care of somebody else, another dependent, it's fundamentally different during the pandemic. And we need to acknowledge that the rate at which products will be made from our project is going to be impacted by this reality. Another thing we need to acknowledge is that there's been a rapid change in several realities of university life. First of all, teaching has been fundamentally altered. We rapidly moved to an online-only teaching in the spring semester, and faculty were not, or students were not prepared for this, and much time was spent. And indeed, in the fall, we've gone from the possibility of doing face-to-face to a very phased approach in which faculty are still scrambling and students are scrambling to adjust to this new phased approach of online only to potentially in-person and back to online only. Fieldwork and travel have been fundamentally altered. For several months, fieldwork was completely shut down. Now it requires special permission to do fieldwork. You can only go as individuals, and so costs have gone up. So instead of taking one vehicle with 4 to 6 people, you now need 4 to 6 vehicles to go. It also means that travel for outreach and education has essentially stopped. And so we must do all those things remotely. Another thing that's fundamentally altered is the use of our faculty research labs and the core facilities. Due to social distancing and the need to clean, all of those individual labs and core facilities now do things much slower than they did before. And indeed, some greenhouses and other facilities have had to shut down for a month or two at a time. This also means that there's been a big change in the access of our constituents across the state to our outreach and education efforts, both because of all the timing issues, but the reality that we can't travel as we would like to. Another thing that COVID-19 has done is it has impacted our budgets. So one of the things that's been caused is that there's now a mismatch in the rate of sample processing and in the amount of spending that happens in personnel. So the rate that we spend on personnel is still the same, but we've slowed down sample processing. So the matching of personnel expenses with sample processing, collection, etc. is now mismatched. There's also been many extra costs, some of which I mentioned in the rapid changes. And these include the need to do more cleaning, changes in our computing, some of the other individual items that we need to do. We've also fundamentally changed some of our programs, such as our high school summer research apprenticeship program has gone completely online. So we had to develop video cameras and kits for them to use. Our work with the reservation has gone completely virtual, and so we've had to supply them with the tools needed to do that virtual work. Now, not everything about COVID-19 is a negative. There's been some opportunities. The first one is that ultimately, with everyone having to do remote work, it's really leveled the playing field throughout the state. In the past, when we did all hands meetings, where we bring the entire project together, people had to travel from all over the state to whatever location we were doing our project, and some people would participate remotely. At that time, the ones that participated remotely did not have the same experience, but now that we're all remote, it makes it nearly the same whether you're calling in from the middle of the reservation or right from your office in Laramie. Another opportunity is that this has improved the relationship between the Wyoming State Health Office and the UW admin. And as Alex Berkeley will talk about later, this is because of the state of Wyoming and the UW administration taking advantage of the data science and indeed some of the sequencing analysis tools that we have to understand the COVID-19 impact on the state. And finally, we've taken advantage of just new science opportunities, as will be discussed in the science and facilities part of these talks. Now, the next thing that I want to address is what we have done to specifically address the programmatic terms and conditions that were required to obtain this cooperative agreement for the Track 1 project. So the first thing is that there were several personnel issues that were part of the programmatic terms and conditions. The most important was that we had a change in the co-PI. One of our co-PIs left between the time the proposal was submitted and it was awarded. And so that approval was made so that Linda Van Diepen was elevated to a co-PI on the project. Another thing is that the programmatic terms and conditions require that we focus on research infrastructure improvement. And as you'll see in our facilities and in our research talks, we have indeed done this. So not only are we answering fundamental science questions, but we're taking the answers to those science questions to generate outcomes and impacts that will allow us to move on to do bigger and better things in our research. And we're transforming our institution by showing how to support core facilities long term. Another thing that we've had to address as part of the programmatic terms and conditions is our project governance. So we have specific plans for how leadership works, and this includes the fact that instead of having just one or two science leads that we have for the whole project, we rotate science leadership through our 4 co-PIs. We're on our 3rd of our 4th co-PIs in this process. I found that it's been extremely useful. One benefit is that no individual scientist shows ownership of the whole science component. Leading this project from the science for those 4 co-PIs is actually quite a burden and a heavy lift, both in terms of their own personal research and their teaching. And so any individual knows there's a light at the end of the tunnel and that you're only doing your project leadership for a short period. And we're also learning and adjusting to each of the different project leaders. And so we can see how we can improve upon both how we develop these large projects, how we develop the leaders of large projects, and how we use modern tools to do our project leadership. We have a state EPSCoR committee, and we are fairly unique in that because we only have one PhD granting institution, the function of our state committee is different than many others. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to bounce ideas off of this state committee. Because of the large turnover in leadership, both at our state and at our university, we've now come up with a new set of bylaws that we will be submitting this fall to EPSCoR, and we will come up with we have some new state committee members that have joined us as a result of these turnovers. We have an external advisory committee. These individuals advise us both on the science components of our project, but they also advise us on how to better integrate our education outreach and diversity components, and especially how to better manage our facilities to achieve the big goals of our project. Finally, we have a required external evaluation. I must say that there's been some frustrations with this particular component. We have given very specific instructions to external evaluators, and unfortunately we have had external evaluators who have not followed those instructions. They have not delivered on their products, and so we have had to switch external evaluators. We now have one that has been working with us very effectively from Colorado State University. Well, another thing that we have found is that external evaluators are more of gatherers of evidence and not as good at synthesizing the evidence. And so at times we've also increased our internal evaluation. So we've found individuals around campus who can better advise us on how to improve our project. We've also looked to other individuals outside of our campus and Wyoming jurisdiction to advise us on our project as well, but they're not formally part of the external advisory committee. Another part of our programmatic terms and conditions is our internal and external reporting. So in a large project like this, it can be quite onerous to put all the materials together for reporting. So with our data team, we've developed what's called microdrop. And so this is a tool that allows all the project participants to update their outcomes and outputs and makes it easy for us to synthesize this. We've also changed some of the structure within the Wyoming EPSCoR office to make the annual report a much smoother process. And this has been primarily the leadership of Associate Director Sarah Conrad in improving our ability to synthesize all of our materials and to get our annual reporting done in a timely and actually with less work way than we did in the past. I've already mentioned the rotating leaders approach to our leadership. This has also meant that in terms of doing our reporting, individual scientists that are leading our project, the 4 co-PIs, only have to do one, and in one case, 2 annual reports for their time as project leaders. Another thing that we do is we have all hands meetings. We try to do these once a semester. These have been very effective at bringing together the entire project team from all over the state. Unfortunately, our scheduled all-hands meeting in April had to be canceled due to the pandemic, and so we will put together a virtual one for this fall. We've also improved our interactions with our external advisory committee. We brought them to campus in October and had an entire day that was dedicated to showing them our entire project. We were able to also show the UW administration the value of our project during this time as well. And we've enjoyed having our external evaluation embedded in some of our programs so that they can understand what we're doing and ultimately provide us more timely and more focused advice. Part of the programmatic terms and conditions was to set up all the baseline reporting, which we took care of prior to the project officially starting. We provided all the baselines. Another important part was the strategic planning. So we did all the strategic plan in the first few months of the project. This set up our outcomes. Last fall, we updated and did some course corrections on our strategic planning, and this included some adjustments in how we decided to do statewide sampling. Overall, we're doing much more sampling than we had originally envisioned, and the samples are happening faster. The processing of some of those samples is a bit slower than we had originally anticipated. Some of it due to slow core facility setup. Some of it now is due to limitations in supplies, especially for doing our liquid handling, and ultimately the slow sequencing that can happen nationally as COVID-19 has changed how some university and commercial labs are operating. Another really important course correction with the Wind River Indian Reservation. As we transition from this first strategic plan to becoming the middle part of our project, our partners on the Wind River Indian Reservation have realized that there still needs to be more set up in terms of facilitating research. And so we've adjusted our strategic plan for that reality. Another part of our programmatic terms and conditions was all the personnel hiring. And so we have met all of our hiring goals, and this includes the graduate students, undergraduate students, postdocs, and faculty. For our faculty hiring for this specific project, there's been 3 required hires that were in our original proposal. These were in place by the fall of 2019. We had a leveraged hire for a 4th, and as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, we lost that individual to Penn State University. There's a requirement to do external project-specific evaluation, and we've also added our own internal evaluation to make sure that we're getting all the proper advice to improve our project. We must have a state committee, and as I mentioned, there are some new bylaws that are going into effect this fall, and we'll have our first meeting later in the middle of the fall with our new bylaws and some new members. And one of the crucial things that we'll be discussing in that is how to continue to improve our relationship between what we do in the Track 1 EPSCoR project and the community colleges. With the budget cutting that's happened in the community colleges, there's some concern about faculty time towards doing research and the relatively heavy teaching loads that those faculty do, and so that'll be a major part of our discussion this fall. Another thing that we do is we monitor our progress in the science and technology plan that was submitted as part of the proposal. Some major components of that science and technology plan were about improving data science. And as you'll see, data science is just a fundamental part of our project, and our setup of our data science center has fundamentally improved our ability to do data science education and to incorporate that into our cutting edge science. We also need to address water issues in the state, and you'll see several examples of where our project is addressing that, either through biogeochemistry or through microbes and organismal interactions, both in relatively intact versus disturbed aquatic settings. And then finally, there was a component of the science and technology plan to address the genomics revolution, and our project is fundamentally improving the ability of our state to engage with genomics and indeed drive that forward as part of a research enterprise. We're required to do $4 million in cost sharing. Our approach to doing this is that part of the state funds that are generated as indirects, those are used to generate that cost share. We focus our cost share on the research infrastructure, so all the major equipment on the project is purchased through the cost share. And we have a fairly large sequencing budget that we use from the cost share as well. In terms of the progress on our strategic plan, the first 3 thrusts are all about the research on our project. And as you'll see in the research presentation, these are almost all on target or ahead of schedule. The one exception here is thrust 1B, which is on the functional traits of microbes. And this one's behind in terms of its metrics, and that's because of some of the sample processing slowdown that happened because of the slow start and securing physical space for our core facilities. And ultimately, that also slows down some of the experiments that need to happen to address these functional traits. Thrust 4 is all about data science, and this is both about education, outreach, and indeed integrating it into our science. And all of this thrust is ahead of schedule. I do want to point out a couple really awesome things that have happened as part of Thrust 4. First is that there's been some private fundraising as companies and the leaders in those companies have seen the value of what University of Wyoming does for data science, and so they've contributed to the Data Science Center. And also you'll see that this data science is absolutely crucial to addressing the COVID-19 opportunities that I mentioned earlier. Thrust 5 is all about the education, outreach, and diversity parts of our project, and overall these things are on target. A few things that are behind schedule that will be noted in those videos and talks is that the micro grants that go to tribal members have been slowed down, and this is primarily because of the capacity of the Wind River Native Advocacy Center to put out these micro grants, and we've been working very closely with them and with Teresa Spoonhunter from Central Wyoming College to help facilitate that. The COVID-19 pandemic has just exacerbated this problem. This has also contributed to some of the missed workshop targets for data science. And a lot of these are missed because these were originally going to be in person, some of them on the reservation. And because of COVID-19, we've had to delay those. And then finally, as will be noted, we had a project where we were going to do some microbial sampling with microbreweries and around the state. But we ran into some intellectual properties and some concerns about faculty knowledge of brewery procedures and competition. And we're still trying to work this out with our legal teams and the brewery legal team, the legal team at the University of Wyoming. But because of the pandemic, we'll have to come back to this as we move later into the fall and the spring. Finally, Thrust 6 is all about management and meeting. In this case, we've been meeting most of our metrics and we're still making improvements. So our annual reporting has become much more streamlined and I think effective. And as I mentioned earlier, this is due primarily to the leadership of Associate Director Sarah Conrad. Our rotating science leadership, as I've mentioned, has been extremely effective. And then finally, we continue to improve and engage with our external and internal evaluation. And we work with our advising and our state committees. We've missed some of our targets in terms of the number of meetings with some of these groups. And depending on the progress of the pandemic, we should be able to catch up either virtually or through in person if the pandemic begins to wane. Now I want to talk about some of the specific project outputs. So we've had one patent that's now completely accepted, and you'll hear about that in the facilities. We've had 20 peer-reviewed publications, 12 proposals that have been funded, and 6 proposals pending. I'm particularly interested in also leveraging private fundraising. And so there's been more than $300,000 raised so far in private fundraising, some of which has gone to data science, and others have gone as a result of our project's interaction with an entity called the Biodiversity Institute at the University of Wyoming. We've hired 3 faculty and 11 postdocs with 1 underrepresented minority. We've had 21 graduate students, and unfortunately we're at 0 underrepresented minority. And we have 53 undergraduates with 12 underrepresented minorities. We're just now getting our first graduations, and we're beginning to track those students' next steps. And as I mentioned earlier, to address those underrepresented minorities for graduate students, we're really working especially on our most important population, this population in the state, which is the 2 sovereign tribes. And so, as I mentioned, we're trying to improve the high school to graduate student pipeline. And so we've already seen that we've got 1 student who's an undergraduate who is a likely candidate for graduate school. We have another student that we hope joins us in the spring from the reservation as an undergraduate student. And so the leadership of the reservation is especially interested in getting some graduate students. But as I mentioned, we also have some other plans institutionally to improve national and global recruitment of underrepresented minorities. We have 28 institutional collaborations within and 14 outside Wyoming. And we've had over 4,000 students impacted around the state, and 10% of those have been underrepresented minorities. Now I want to turn to some future things. So some opportunities that our project is stimulating. First, you'll hear about some seed funding, and this is primarily engaged a lot of assistant and to early career faculty. And we're really excited to see where their research projects expand the microbial and data science parts of our project. We're able to engage with emerging areas of science, including that associated with COVID-19. And you'll see that our facilities and our new equipment and some of our data analyses are leading us there. And you also hear about some really awesome opportunities that are occurring in entrepreneurship that are leveraging our project and indeed starting to help the 2 sovereign tribes understand the value of entrepreneurship. So I want to end with, what's the vision of where we're going to go as a result of our project? Well, our first vision is that microbiomes and microbial ecology are just fundamental to better understanding how organisms and ecosystems work, and University of Wyoming is going to be at the forefront of that understanding. We've also made fundamental improvements, and we continue to expect that we will see that our data and computational science will be driving science forward, and indeed we will be right at the forefront of the genomics revolution as it continues into the future. We also want to leverage how Track 1 projects, these $20 million projects, research how it can transform institutions, as I've mentioned about the core facilities and how our research mission itself is viewed by the state of Wyoming. And then finally, we want to bring our research impacts and opportunities to all areas and populations of the state. And so these include the underrepresented minorities that are in our state. And one thing I'll mention is that the science initiative was funded by our state legislature at overall about $120 million, including almost $100 million for a new science initiative building, and then the other programs. And our core facilities and our faculty are a fundamental part of utilizing that investment to improve the research, education, and outreach impact for our state.